Okay, welcome back to another lecture in our Native American history class. I am going to do a few things here. So first of all, this will be the last lecture for this particular series. And we've had lots of supplemental reading, right? And so for students who've been taking the class and reading through the syllabus or reading something like Ned Blackhock's book or Kathleen Duvall's book or something like that, we know that these big books that have come out that have been kind of New York Times bestsellers recently, they've been trying to add in to enrich the story of American or Native American history. And excuse my uh, beings there, but and that's really good. But no one book can do everything, right? And so they had given, I think, because there's been a lot of previous exposure to things like the Plains Indian Wars or to the struggle for the Black Hills, for example, which Ward Churchill gives a great account of in his book Struggle for the Land. That story is not covered in like Ned Blackhock's book or in Kathleen Duvall's book. So you want to be careful. Don't take one book that you've been assigned or that you've read, even if it's like 500 pages long. That won't be enough of the story. And another thing that Ned Blackhock's book doesn't really deal very much with is the American Indian movement. So this lecture is going to look back to some of the earlier phenomena, going back to the 1868 treaty, actually, at Fort Laramie, and see how developments within the US government shape things throughout the 20th century. And so the two forces I'm going to mostly focus on are American Indian movement, which is not the only Native movement. There's Indians of all tribes. There are lots of groups, but American Indian movement is definitely the most famous from the 1960s and 70s, and ongoing in some cases up till today. But I'll say a little bit more about fracturing within the American Indian movement. And then at the very end of class, I'm not bringing us all the way into the 21st century exactly, but we are witnessing and living through a resurgence of indigenous activism across both continents. And so I will end with a bit of a nod to the Red Deal, which is a policy program put out by a group called the Red Nation. They are down in Albuquerque, and they are, um, among one of the dominant voices. I don't know that leader is the right word, right? But Nick Estes, who also has a really great book called Our History is the Future, and he has a great book on Standing Rock, the protests here in the US that are very recent. And so the thing I want to emphasize here is, like, first of all, like, one class and one lecture or several lectures can't cover all of the stuff, but what you want to pay attention to for the native movements that are ongoing is that, yeah, it's like that there are native people still here that are behind those movements. And we see a resurgence of activism by native people, but not only directed at and for native people, right? When we're looking at the kind of environmental activism that's going on with something like the Red Deal. So I'll say more about that to end the lecture, but let's go ahead and jump into um, PowerPoint stuff. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I've titled this um, PowerPoint presentation here, um, Red Power, AIM, and COINTELPRO. Uh, but and to do this, we're really going to need to kind of take a step back. And the main book I'm going to be referring to is by a controversial figure in Native American studies in general named Ward Churchill, um, uh, who um, was fired for political reasons for things that he had said from CU Boulder in the early 2000s. It became national news. And there were charges of plagiarism thrown at him, charges that he wasn't a native person. So, like, that's a unfortunate aspect of some of the politics around Native studies is people claiming that somebody is not Native or start making identity claims about another person to intentionally destroy their reputation or their career. So that definitely happened. Ward Churchill won, just to be very clear, because like the newspapers like love to talk about a scandal, but they don't always want to say that much about how things end. So just to let you know, Churchill won all of his um, court cases here in Colorado, and beat the charges of plagiarism and all of that sort of stuff, which were kind of trumped up because he said some very incendiary things in the post 9/11 moment that I don't need to go into exactly here. But outside of being a controversial political figure, Ward Churchill is a great historian in his own right and a really, really great scholar of genocide studies and comparative genocide. So within the field of genocide studies, he's still very, very important and widely read. And uh, he has a book called Agents of Repression, and that's going to be the main shadow text behind this. So if you're wanting to like check out more details or where I'm getting this information, because some of it is quite controversial, that's the book I would point you to first. And so one of the things that Churchill does in true native fashion, I think, in the ways I've been teaching this course, is that when he develops agents of repression, he doesn't just start with um, the political situation in the 1970s. Rather, he goes back um, as far as the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. Remember, there were two of them, but that Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 closes Indian treaty making and closes the Plains Wars. And then that doesn't mean violence and conflict doesn't end because we see that just emerging right after. But the treaty making era with native populations ends at that particular time. Uh, Already before then, native relations had moved from the Department of War to the Department of Interior. So relationships with native peoples become about reservations, about forced boarding schools and school systems on reservations. And then that is a new era of genocidal policies towards Native Americans, such as the 1887 Dawes Act. Um, we've looked at the 1883 Act outlawing native practices, traditional practices, things like that. And then remember from earlier lectures, just kind of hovering through stuff from last week, uh, the 1924 Citizenship Act imposes, from many Native people's perspective, imposes U.S. citizenship onto natives. It's not necessarily a good thing because it assumes that the dominant colonizing power of the United States is the final arbiter of all relationships. And then we get in 1934 the Indian Reorganization Act, right? That act, which is sometimes called the Indian New Deal, changes things, and some things get better for some people and some things get worse for other folks. So there's no way when we're talking about Native American issues, there's no way to talk about everybody at once in any particular fashion, other than the fact that all Native peoples face the oppressing for colonizing force of the United States and the European powers from even before the United States and the ongoing rights throughout both continents, North and South America. Um, so when we're looking at things that inform the American Indian movement in the 1970s and stuff, if you think back to our class over the semester, what we have seen is whether we're going all the way back to early so-called New England, where we're looking at Usamakan or Metacom, we see different alliances of different groups of native nations crossing nations to form alliances with each other. We see even before European contact, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had been an alliance of different groups. And so that is the pattern I would like to draw my students' attention to when I'm talking about these so-called, sometimes called pan-Indian movements because when we look at it from that at a pattern that precedes European contact but continues to develop with different relations with Europeans, then we see we're able to kind of keep more of a lens on that kind of native issue from the land, right? Not from the sea, to use Stephen Newcomb's terms again. And so we could go to Pontiac's War and during the Seven Years' War. We could go um, to Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa in the War of 1812 years in there. We could look at different alliances and the ways that the U.S. military pitted different plains groups against each other, like tensions between Crow and Lakota folks, for example. We could look at uh, the early attempts by Desgahay and Haudenosaunee Confederacy to seek some sort of recognition from the League of Nations, later to become the United Nations. And then we could finally look at the American Indian movements or Indians of all tribes, for example, from the 60s and 70s, all the way up to groups like the Red Nation today. There have long been alliances across different native nations to create some sort of political change, sometimes military change as well. That's just part of what Native American relations are. They're not static or stay the same. And they change even within relationship to the occupying force or the colonizing power like the United States. So, when we look back from the United States perspective here, there are some things that are very important that precede the development of the American Indian movement. Um, so first of all, we see so part of this is like the development of how the Federal Bureau of Investigations comes into being, right? Because the FBI ends up being the main arm of the US's colonizing force against AIM in the 1970s. So in 1917 and 1918, we have two laws that are passed, and they or acts that are passed into law that tell us a lot about if we were talking in a class about race in U.S. history, which I sometimes teach. These two acts have a lot to do with that situation. So not only Native people, but the 1917 Espionage Act and then the 1918 Alien Sedition Act. These acts sometimes show up again, even in recent politics, around contestations around citizenship. So they precede that 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, right? Um, there is a recent Martin Scorsese movie, a famous movie about the famous Osage murders. Although in Scorsese's movie, like most colonizer movies, It's mostly told from the so-called white or Euro-Christian characters' perspective, more than from the native perspective. But it did, as a movie, at least attempt to draw attention to the phenomenon of the Osage murders, or which are also called the Reign of Terror, which moved from the 1910s to the 1930s. A better, or at least supplementary, way of looking at that history, if you're looking about thinking about research papers and things like that, is the In Trust podcast. I've got a link for that, but if you just go to where you get podcasts from and type in Trust, it's a really nice investigative journalist approach to the Osage murders. Then we get J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, being kind of uh, his, the first initial director. There are a few earlier forms of the FBI. It changes from the Bureau of Investigators to the Federal Bureau. But we get J. Edgar Hoover, who's the director from 1924 to 1972. They put out in 1931 this thing called the Uniform Crime Report. So this is like looking at crime across the entire nation, and the FBI used and still uses public media campaigns to promote a positive view of the Bureau, i.e., Public Enemy Number One or gangster films, all the way into to recent cops shows. That's all part of that same kind of history, which would be a nice research project, maybe even outside of Native American studies, is like those shows that are about supposed to be propaganda for American public opinion about crime and criminals, right? The FBI changes its name from to the Federal Bureau, from the earlier Bureau of Investigation. The National Congress of the American Indian is formed in 1944 after some other laws are passed that allow some Native peoples to um, contest some things with the U.S. government. So we see this big shift towards legal cases. And then the FBI in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s develop a program called their counterintelligence program. A lot of it, the main thrust of it is against the counterculture movements of the 1960s, broadly speaking. So Black Panthers, American Indian movement, the women's movement, hippie movement, psychedelic movement, all of that kind of stuff. Civil rights movements. Um, COINTELPRO is just like it's not really an acronym, but it just is a condensed word of the counterintelligence program developed by the FBI. So they focused on discrediting of public figures that might be seen as incendiary or controversial or challenging the U.S. government. So they created intentional discrediting and disinformation campaigns on Martin Luther King Jr., on Malcolm X, and then on the Black Panthers later when they develop. Same thing, they do a disinformation. So it's a public smear campaign, and this kind of stuff makes its way into public discourse and continues all the way today, right? I mean, for me, like growing up and learning about this history, the Black Panthers are American heroes, but there are other people out there who will see them as anti-American or something like that, right? The American Indian movement was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis by Dennis Banks, who's a Ojibwe, Clyde Belcourt, who's a Anishinaabe, and George Mitchell Anishinaabe. And then in Denver, there's a Denver relationship because of the Belcourts here. There's Vernon Belcourt. And then in Cleveland, a chapter opened up with Russell Means and his family. Russell Means is going to become a major figure in the American Indian movement. Um, You'll notice that some of my colleagues, such as Tink Tinker and Glenn Morris, Tink Tinker is Washache or Osage, and Glenn Morris is Shawnee, who runs the Fourth World Center for Indigenous Law at University of Colorado, Denver. They are both members of Colorado American Indian Movement, and they push back on that idea of using the term Native Americans. So we want to be careful when in doubt, just ask. But because they were identified with the American Indian movement, they used the name Indian intentionally. And they see the cleaning up of language, the use of a term like Native American, as a kind of uh, something imposed by kind of like white academic culture and things like that. Contested across different Native groups. Different Native people want to be addressed in different ways. Of course, addressing somebody by their nation is the most respectful way that you can do it if you know. But then there are also all sorts of things within traditional culture, right? Oftentimes, clan affiliation is more important, but it's not necessarily the thing that's advertised right away. So just be careful if especially if you're not native, about making assumptions about terminology. This is a quote from Churchill's book. He says the organization of AIM was self-consciously patterned after the Black Panthers community self-defense model pioneered by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale 2 years previously in Oakland, California. AIM chapters quickly sprang up around the country and began to attract those who would comprise the organization's future leadership. AIM definitely develops out of prison populations, which is an important thing to remember. Now let's look at some of the precursors again, flipping back to the US government's side of this stuff. The FBI precursors. So right after the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, in 1871, Congress appropriates $50,000 to establish the Department of Justice. That's kind of news to some of my United States citizen students, right? That the Department of Justice wasn't even founded until 1871, or sorry, established in 1870. And then it gets allocated funding. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was a private law enforcement company that was established in 1850, and it was used to recruit agents for the new Department of Justice. In 1886, there is in US history this thing called the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, where a bunch of anarchists were protesting for 8-hour working days. That's what they wanted, was a labor protest. They had confrontations with the police. Someone, no one knows exactly knows who, threw a bomb when police attempted to disperse a peaceful protest the day after a worker had been murdered. During the bombing, 7 police died and 4 civilians and many died, and then many more were wounded. In response to the Haymarket affair, 8 anarchists were tried and convicted to death on conspiracy charges, though none threw the bomb, and only 2 were present at the event. One may have helped to build the bomb. We don't know exactly there. International coverage of the event helped establish International Workers' Day as May 1st, celebrated all over the world, but not in the United States. Instead, to not encourage labor movements, the United States moved and made Labor Day a federal holiday in 1894, which of course is the first Monday in September. Grover Cleveland was worried about celebrating which had been commemorated by the Second International and Socialist and Communist parties in Paris in 1889. The Department of Justice at this point in time began keeping secret files on socialists and communists. Then in 1887, the same year as the Dawes Act, we see the interstate trade regulations being tasked to the Department of Justice. Why is that important in a Native American history class? Because if you remember back to the United States Constitution, the Constitution says that it is Congress that will be dealing with Native American peoples, and it will also be dealing with interstate trade. So there is a crossover in terms of economic thought between Native American interests and interstate trade because this is part of the federal government. Remember, we have federal Indian law, which has exceeds state laws. So all of those early cases that start founding federal Indian law, right, like the John Marshall trilogy, for example, are important to be thinking about there. Um, in 1896, we see the National Bureau of Criminal Identification formed to identify well-known criminals. In 1901, there's the assassination of President McKinley, and that adds to the perception that the U.S. is under threat from anarchists. Teddy Roosevelt, and now there's like new TV shows and stuff coming out celebrating Teddy Roosevelt, but he was really nasty towards Native peoples. But Teddy Roosevelt ordered the Attorney General Charles Bonaparte, who's the great grandnephew to Napoleon Bonaparte, to form a separate investigating agency. Congress at the time worried about establishing a secret police and demands no personnel from the U.S. Treasury Department can participate in this these organizations that are being the precursors to what becomes the FBI. So in 1908, the Bureau of Investigation is formed, and then it becomes the FBI, Federal Bureau, in 1935. What do they do? Like I said, they use public media to make law enforcement look like the good guys. Think about how many TV shows even now, right? Like feature some sort of either cop or FBI person, sort of law enforcement person, and the challenges that they face. It doesn't matter if it's 24 or I don't know, there was a Kevin Bacon one recently that I was looking at. Um, uh, Over and over again in movies and films, we see films that feature the government, the G-man, right? So, for little kids in the 1930s, they developed uh, radio shows and pulp classics like G-Men and The Feds, right? So I've got some pictures here. Really great honors thesis or master's or even doctoral thesis project might be on these kinds of things and how they impact history because what they do, I will argue here, is they go back to those um, uh, Buffalo Bill stories, to General Custer's uh, autobiography, where he talks about what a great Indian killer he is, and before he faces his demise at the Battle of the Greasy Grass in the 1870s as well. So what we see is this kind of culture of pulp novels and stories that have been being told, and we see it in literature too, right? I mentioned the leather stockings tales of Fenimore Cooper's American novels, right? Like Last of the Mohicans being the most famous one there. So those all feed into this kind of public, like especially federal government program to make law enforcement look good, to teach people who public enemy number one is, and then to discredit through counterintelligence programs anybody who seems to be a protester or a threat. When we look back to the Native American side, then when we go back to the American Indian movement's precursors here, we see that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie reduced the lands and ended Red Cloud's war. So when we think about people, these famous chiefs like Red Cloud or um, Crazy Horse, for example, uh, they for somebody who's native in the American Indian movement, they are looking back to those earlier figures like Red Cloud here, right? In 1874, the reports of gold show up in the Black Hills. Congress then attempts to buy the land area back, even though they've just treated with the natives. In Special Order 117, Custer was sent to the area. He takes 700 men, several geologists to assess mineral wealth. In 1875, we see the Jenny expeditions being sent to the area. Newspapers, then fed by Custer, stoke war with natives as imminent. Now, actually, what's happening to Plains groups, native groups during the time is they're basically being starving. and being moved to reservations, right? But the public media in the United States against Native peoples says that the natives are going to come, that there's going to be a ghost dance religion. It's going to they're going to come wipe out all of the settlers who are, of course, squatting in native land that has been made through treaty with the United States. November 22nd in 1875, W. W. Belknap announces war that there will be war if the Lakota don't give up to white men. And then in 1876, we get the little Battle of Little Bighorn, which of course kills Custer. In the 1870s and 1880s, we see a systemic takedown of major Lakota leaders through the BIA and the U.S. Army. We also saw the Indian Crimes Act, which I mentioned earlier from 1883, the Dawes Act from 1887, and then disinformation campaigns about the ghost dance religion, which had no military dimension, and certainly was no major threat. Then we see the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, the 1924 Citizenship Act, the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which creates new tribal governments largely modeled on the colonizer state. So, in some ways, while it improves some relations for some Native groups, it also takes traditional modes of leadership and reorganizes them with models that look like the colonizer state. Um, uh, Traditional ceremonies become allowed again, but boarding schools and Christianization and assimilation policies remain heavily at work, resulting in large tensions throughout the era. In 1943, the National Congress for the American Indian, which still exists today, was created to confront termination policies to try and for the U.S. government to get out of its obligations through treaties to Native folks. In 1944, we see the Pick-Sloan Act Plan, which attempts to preempt Lakota water rights, and we get lots of uh, dams being built, and that will factor into the recent stuff from the Red Nation and the Red Deal, is that the New Deal, which was meant to sort of kickstart the U.S. government's economy during the Depression, created these big dam projects that are also really destructive to native land and environmentally disastrous in some cases. In the 1950s, we see the official Indian termination policy being wheeled out by the U.S. government in response, right, to that um, genocide convention, right? Because if there are no formal relationships between natives and the U.S. government, then the U.S. government can no longer be charged for charged with genocide against native peoples, right? So um, termination is accompanied by urban relocation, which disperses natives to various cities where transnational alliances were made. So we're seeing in that move from of native peoples from reservations to urban areas, already there's a mixing going on of lots of different nations, of different native people. That's why when you get these movements like the American Indian movement, why they embrace that term Indian, or Indians of all tribes, for example, right? In 1961, we see the formation of the National Indian Youth Council based on broader student nonviolence coordinating committee initiatives. We see Clyde Warrior, who coins the term Red Power and produces a newspaper, ABC, which stood for America Before Columbus. We see that the NCAI had fishing rights struggles, and you can see support from major actors like Marlon Brando in fights over that stuff. In 1964, we see the Indian Civil Rights Act being enacted. So again, on the one hand, it's it's a civil rights act that's for Native peoples, but on the other hand, it just by being negotiated through the U.S. courts, it assumes that the U.S., which is a colonizing force, is the only litigating force and is the most dominant force in the land. So it plays into further colonization at the same time, just like the earlier Citizenship Acts, right? So then 1968 to 69, we see the Third World Liberation Front strikes at Berkeley University in California. And that those strikes helped create what we now know today as the Ethnic, Native, and Indigenous Studies programs. Those, of course, are the programs that have been under attack at universities by recent moves in conservative government, with the Trump administration and Project 2025, right? When they're attacking universities, it's an attack on these civil rights movements from the 1960s that create race consciousness. So the people who say don't say race, don't say gay, don't say like all of that kind of stuff as a reaction to the earlier civil rights movements for these different groups. We get during this era the problem of sovereignty. um, Younger activists, some of them whom had been to college, start using this term sovereignty because they're in their activism. So they began to adopt the colonial language of sovereignty for international recognition. What do Native peoples want? They want sovereignty or self-determination, right? That was the going tagline. But the younger people did it without really like being fully conscious of that the fact that that term sovereignty only makes sense within Euro-Christian legal practices that go back from to before the United States government existed, right? So the term was totally foreign to native elders on reservations who were not colonized enough to understand what the term even meant. So it created confusion. Meanwhile, new tribal governments modeled themselves on the settler colonial state and at times rejected the young activists, some of whom were coming from urban centers with no official connection to the reservation, right? So this is conflict within Native communities. Then we have the racist and genocidal blood quantum laws that have been going on since the late 1800s. Um, uh, but the whole idea of blood quantum only is both a racist and a colonized idea, with ideas like half-breed or medi, or with an S, as well, up in Canada, people who are half native, half Euro-Christian, right? So that permeates the discourse on both on and off reservations. And then we see the devastation of assimilation policies from the 1950s and 60s, which made a generation of elders suspicious of and or neglectful of traditional ways. So what you have is like younger activists in the 60s and 70s kind of longing for traditional ways, but you had a couple of generations of people who had been forced into boarding schools who were native who are saying, no, we gave all of that up, right? And so they either don't have the knowledge or it's clouded or lost or foggy in people's memory. And so the younger activists start to revive things. So it's during this time period that things like the Sundance get revived by AIM groups during the late 60s, early 70s. So these efforts by the young activists got mixed support from elders, depending on how colonized the elders were. So when they did get access to traditional knowledge, it was not and never had been transferred according to blood quantum or tribal enrollment or some idea of citizenship. Those are all ideas from the occupying force of the colonizing government, right? The Euro-Christian oppressors. Here are AIM's initial values. Just see how controversial this might seem to you, right? Okay. Following the Black Panthers lead, American Indian movement's initial goals were stop child removal, stop taking our children and adopting them into white families. So stop stealing our children. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't seem too controversial to me, but it does play into the Genocide Convention, right? Because forced removal of children is something that can a factor that can go into charging people with or a government with genocide. stop police violence against Native people, address poverty, especially in these new urban areas where all these Native people in the 50s under Termination Act were promised they were going to have these great jobs and great lives, and then they get to the cities and this and they're living in ghettos. Early AIM activism had multiple public display movements, right? So here there's an element of performance of native activism that we could trace also back to those things like the Buffalo Bill show, right? Where native peoples are going and traveling all over Europe, right? People like Black Elk, for example, people like Sitting Bull, who participates in that as well before he's murdered on the reservation, as part of that, defamation campaign against native chiefs who had been um, antagonists to the U.S. military during the 1870s and 1880s, right? So we could see that Native people sometimes have to participate in the performance of nativeness for other people. And they do that, whether it's Descahe at the United Nations or Native groups setting up teepees outside the Native Nations and doing these, wearing clothing that signals their traditional cultures becomes kind of part of a public performance, right? In the same way that the FBI is using media campaigns to create comic books to make all little kids in the United States love the FBI. So, occupation of Alcatraz occurs in the 1970s. I know that there are current efforts under Donald Trump in his second administration to reopen Alcatraz as a prison, but it had been closed. And so, according to native treaties, any land that the US government gives up is supposed to revert back to native peoples. So that was the thinking around Alcatraz was like, here you have this abandoned island that used to be a prison. The US government has neglected it and left it. So the native activists go in and they take it over and occupy it. So the occupation lasted from November of 1869 to June of 1971. Indians of all tribes were led by Richard Oakes, who was Mohawk and who was later murdered, and the murderer of Richard Oakes was acquitted. Another leader in the movement was Lenata Warjack, who later marries Russell Means, who becomes Lenata Means, Shoshone and Bannock. We see the AIM member John Trudell, who's Santee, Dakota, ran Radio Free Alcatraz broadcasts, and we see that there were 400 people at the height of the occupation. What you want to notice is that all of these younger Native activists are coming from different Native nations, right? And forming this identity, which is either American Indian movement or Indians of all tribes. Then some more early AIM activism. We see in 1970 an occupation of the Mayflower replica at Plymouth Rock. In 1971, there's an anti-Thanksgiving ceremony at Mount Rushmore. In 1971, against which establishes the federal holiday of Columbus Day, which is still a federal holiday, but we've removed it from the state of Colorado where it started. Um, uh, the Columbus Day holiday, the federal holiday, was first established in 1937, moves from October 12th to the second Monday in October. Um, in 1971, we see the occupation of abandoned Coast Guard nations such as Milwaukee. Oh, also, and just while I'm on the thinking about the Columbus Day holiday, think about how recent that is, right? Because like a lot of people, when I used to go up to the Capitol and testify against Columbus Day being racist and genocidal, um, you get all this kind of pushback, this political pushback from people who don't know the history at all of this stuff. It's like it hasn't even been a holiday that long when we're thinking about it. It's not like people have been celebrating Columbus since 1493. Um, uh, then in 1971, we see a short occupation of the BIA in Washington, D.C. occupation of abandoned Coast Guard stations near Milwaukee. 1972, we see the Trail of Broken Treaties, which occupies the Department of Interior, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs. During this occupation, activists steal multiple documents and hide some of them in non-federally recognized Lumbee territory. Now, some Lumbee groups actually that Donald Trump has recognized earlier this year. But this was a great tactic, I think, by American Indian movement because what it shows and what I want you to be aware of is that for Native peoples aligning with other Native peoples, especially during this time, you did not need another Native group did not need to be recognized by the federal government in order for Natives to recognize each other. But sometimes in politics today, and unfortunately, in charges against people's identity in academia, for example, people say like, "Oh, well, they're not really a native because the U.S. government didn't recognize them." But that already gives power to the U.S. government to tell you who a native and who is not a native, right? So be careful with that kind of stuff. Why do we have census reports? Why do census reports break people down in terms of race? What's going on there? Those are bigger questions to be thinking about. 1973, AIM was invited, and that's an important idea, by Native women, elders, particularly women elders. They were invited to occupy Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and that created a major standoff with the federal government, with the FBI. During the time with the Trail of Broken Treaties, let's look at some of the policies that the natives wanted to have happen. They want the restoration of treaty making, which had been ended by Congress in 1871. Why? Because treaty making is a nation to nation agreement that recognizes Native people as nations. If you have like a government to government relationship, which sometimes gets used, or a city to city, like oh, the Denver is a city sister city to Wind River Reservation or up in Wyoming or something like that. Those are not federal recognized treaties, right? So what that even when people want to sound like they're being progressive, what they're doing is further eroding the obligations and the recognition that the United States has had since its founding that Native peoples are separate nations. Why don't we see reservations on political maps of the United States, for example? That's another form of rhetorical erasure of Native peoples that makes the general public in the United States unaware that Native people continue to exist, and unsympathetic to Native people when they talk about the ongoing erasure of relationships through treaties. So we see also, the Trail of Broken Treaties wants to provide opportunities for Indians to leaders to address Congress directly. They want to review treaty commitments and violations, have ratified treaties reviewed by the Senate, ensure that all American Indians are governed by treaty relations, provide relief to Native nations as compensation for treaty rights and violations, recognize the right of Indians to interpret treaties, create the Joint Congressional Committee to reconstruct relations with Indians, restore 110 million acres of land taken away from Native populations by the United States, restore terminated rights of Native nations, especially from the 1950s, repeal state jurisdiction on Native tribes, which they never should have had anyway, according to the U.S. Constitution, provide federal protection for offenses against Indians, abolish the Bureau of Indian Affairs, create a new Office of Federal Indian Relations, remedy a breakdown in constitutionally prescribed relationships between the United States and Native nations, ensure immunity of Native nations from state commerce regulation, taxes, and trade restrictions, protect Indian religious freedom and cultural integrity, establish the national Indian voting within local options, free national Indian organizations from government controls and reclaim and affirm the health, housing, employment, economic development, and education for all Indian peoples. Some pretty specific lists of things that what Native people wanted, and the trail of broken treaties, and that continues in things like the Red Deal all the way up to today. At the same time, if we want to be very clear about this, by making the trail of broken treaties policies um, happen, here are Native people extending a hand and willing to negotiate with the US government, right? This is different than people like, you know, storming the Capitol or enacting forms of violence to try and like destroy the US government. No, it's actually about a set of policies that are about relations, forming a better relationship with the US government and the trail of broken treaties here. Then we see that occupation of Wounded Knee at Pine Ridge Reservation, which is, it's about 8 hours from here in Denver if you drive up through Nebraska, just on the northern border of Nebraska and South Dakota is the Pine Ridge Reservation and Wounded Knee. During the 1970s, there was a tribal chair named Dickie Wilson. He had dissolved the multi-member tribal council. Remember, that goes back to the Indian Reorganization Act, right? Where you have these new tribal councils and new tribal governments that are formulating they're kind of mimicking the structures of the US government, right? And against the traditional ways that elders had governed Native communities, right? So creates all sorts of problems within Native groups. So what Dickie Wilson did was he dissolved a multi-member council, consolidated it down to 5 people who were all on his side. This infuriated the elders on the Pine Ridge Reservation, but Wilson had the backing of the BIA, so he's kind of working along with the US government and the feds. That's why the elders asked AIM to come in, even though Russell Means is Oglala, Lakota. He was mostly raised out off of the reservation, right? But he is invited back in by his elders, along with AIM, to draw attention to this particular issue. Dickie Wilson then allowed for part of the Pine Ridge Reservation to be used for the U.S. military and allowed liquor on the reservation and benefited under the table from arrangements with suppliers. So this was another thing that really infuriated elders and Native folks within the community. The two Pine Ridge murders were also not being addressed by Wilson, who had appointed his own goon squad, and that stands for Guardians of the Oglala Nation. The tribal police then became in line with the U.S. government, the colonizing government, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that creates like nasty politics within the reservation itself. Tribal council members then voted to impeach Wilson in 1973, but he used tactics to delay the vote and move the hearing to a time that he would get votes in his favor. So we see some voter suppression going on. And then we see 1972, Wilson blocked Russell Means and AIM from testifying at Pine Ridge following the trail of broken treaties, right? So this is all leading up to the Wounded Knee occupation, right? And why is it at Wounded Knee? It's of course because there's memory back to the 1890 massacre, right? So other factors that are going on here, the feds were already angry with AIM due to Alcatraz and the trail of broken treaties, where AIM had successfully used media support to draw national attention to the force of the government's to force the government's hand. So that's why Native people perform as Native, right, or dress up as Native. There's something political about doing that because it drew public attention to the bad deal that the U.S. government was giving to Native peoples. So FBI agents at the time under COINTELPRO were working undercover and they participated in the BIA occupation. So you have undercover FBI agents that are disguising themselves as activists and going into government buildings that are being occupied, but doing all sorts of vandalism and destruction that then that hurts the image of the movement itself. Right. So that's part of what counterintelligence programs do, right, is to destroy the credibility of a movement. Elder women such as Gladys Bissonette and Ellen Movescamp contacted AIM to intervene and suggested symbolic occupation at Wounded Knee. Russell Means returned to Pine Ridge and started to run for tribal presidency, challenging Wilson in 1974. The Means platform on tribal sovereignty or focused on tribal sovereignty. So the feds backed Wilson against Russell Means because they hate the American Indian movement. The occupation of Wounded Knee involved about 200 people, 54 cars, and it was meant to be peaceful, but the feds moved in after the occupation of a trading post near the Wounded Knee massacre site, which is a mass grave up there. AIM largely used arms from the store that they occupied, so they didn't necessarily go in looking exactly for the fight. In the news media, the feds claimed that the AIM had hostages, but the store owners and others came out and said that they were not hostages. So these are non-native store owners. They said that they would rather stay with AIM because they were afraid that the US government was destroying their homes and killing AIM members. The occupation lasted from February 27th to May 8th, 1973, and it was all over the news every night alongside with like the Vietnam War and things like that, right? So this was a time where Native people got a lot of support from the US public, right? And the more support, the more media attention that Natives got, the harder it was for the US government to continue its nasty tactics. So again, a quote from from George, from Ward Churchill's Agents of Repression. William A. Regart, who was 86 years old at the time and supposedly one of the hostages, put it this way in an interview. He says, "The fact is that we as a group of hostages decided to stay and save AIM and our own property. Had we not, those troops would have come down here and killed all those people." So you have non-native people, white folks or Euro-Christian folks hanging out so that like because they are afraid that if they leave that due to the racism against native peoples that the US government is just going to come in and massacre them. So the real hostages, says this non-native person, were the AIM people. Then we have a murder spree on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which created it as one of the murder capitals of the United States during this period. And this particular case with Leonard Peltier, who was only recently allowed to leave prison. He's still under house arrest by President Biden at the last day of President Biden's presidency. There's been activism since the 1970s and 80s about the ways that Leonard Peltier had become a political prisoner. So lots to be said. There are documentary films on this issue as well. And then there's lots of different information that has come out over the years. So between 1974 and 76, there were several murders on the Pine Ridge Reservation due to that fallout of the Wounded Knee occupation and between AIM and the goons, like that Dickie Wilson's goons and AIM, right? So natives fighting natives. Peltier was then sentenced to 2 life terms for shooting FBI agents in 1975. Agents that were killed had been in an unmarked car and in plain clothes. And the way that one way to look at it anyway is that native people who were already scared, like they were scared, people were murdering each other. So this like these FBI agents come in unmarked, not letting anybody know who they are, following people around. they are mistaken for goons, and so there is a retaliation against them. There's conflicting evidence over various AR-15 casings at the scene because you have people shooting at the FBI agent's car, but the agents were apparently killed by an AR-15 at close range following the firefight. And Leonard Peltier had an AR-15, but the casings in the victims did not match those fired into the car. So two other AIM members were cleared of charges. So basically, after this gunfight, Peltier and a couple of other guys go on the run because they're first housed by some elders on the reservation, and then they go on the run. Then two of the AIM figures get picked up, but Leonard Peltier makes his way to Canada. So the two other AIM members get cleared of their charges. The FBI, then they're looking for somebody to blame for the murders of these two FBI agents. They want to pin it on somebody. That's what law enforcement wants to do to give this perception that justice has been done. So what they do is they get Leonard Peltier um, uh, uh, extradited from Canada, where he had fled to. Peltier was unable to use a self-defense plea. And then in the trial, the FBI withheld evidence and lied to get him before the trial, the FBI withheld evidence and lied to get him extradited from Canada. Peltier then so he goes to prison. He is briefly broken out of prison, or he escapes prison in 1979, but then is caught in California. That's another phenomenon from activists in the 70s. Like Timothy Leary is broken out of prison by the Black Panthers, right? There's all sorts of stuff going on. Um, remains He remains imprisoned at least the time when I was last fall making this slide here. He is out now. And I still think that really technically he remains imprisoned because he's under house arrest. He was not given uh his sentence was not commuted, right? He's still considered a prisoner of the United States, even though he's like really old now and he's allowed to just like live out his remaining days at home. So, many activists over the years, including the Dalai Lama, Pope Francis, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, and Amnesty International, had all called for Leonard Peltier's release. He is being held as a political prisoner, as a way to hold somebody accountable for two FBI men who are murdered, but nobody knows exactly who murdered them. And the casings did not come from his gun. So that's the forensics has shown that. Obama denied clemency for Peltier in 2017. Supporters of Peltier now include 38 of the judge's former clients. Court of Appeals acknowledges that the FBI misconducted and was withholding evidence, and the United Nations Human Rights Council charges that his rights have been denied under arbitrary detention. So even though, it is good from one perspective that Leonard Peltier has been allowed, since he's in such bad health, to leave the prison and go back home, but he's still under house arrest. So none of these things that all these activists and major religious figures in the world have called for have been done, right? So I don't want to leave students with the impression that Leonard Peltier is really free. Another murder that happens, and this creates a divide and a splintering of the American Indian movement, who is Anime Akash. She had participated in the Trail of Broken Treaties. Her corpse was found on February 24th, 1976, on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The initial coroner's report said that she died of exposure, but it was later found that she died of execution style of a gunshot. Conflicting reports suggest that Akash was executed that there had been an order by higher ups in the American Indian movement because the FBI circled rumors as part of their COINTEL program that she was an informant. So that causes a splinter within the American Indian movement, right? Was the order actually given by Native people to kill another Native person? And then what was actually happening? What was the kind of pressure that FBI was putting onto Anime Akash at the time? Was she really an informant or was she caught in something, right? So FBI interviewed and threatened her in 1975, apparently saying that that they warned her that she wouldn't live out the year unless she cooperated. So that's again from Churchill's book. This causes the fracturing of AIM. In 1974, Russell or Dennis Banks and Russell Means were tried for conspiracy and assault at the federal courthouse in St. Paul. Remember that conspiracy charge thing, right? Go all the way back to the Haymarket Affair, right? After a 9-month trial, AIM was declared victory when Judge Fred J. Nichols, citing government misconduct, dismissed all the charges. The movement, however, had already begun to splinter. There was infighting and jealousy, and the FBI's efforts to divide them had sown suspicion and paranoia within groups because you have FBI agents posing within the movement itself. The murder then of Anime Akash, whose body was discovered on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1975, marked the beginning of the end of the United American Indian Movement. Members blamed the FBI and one another, destroying the trust within the initial movement. AIM's last major action took place in 1978 with a movement and with an event called the Longest Walk. The longest walk was commenced to protest the imprisonment of AIM activist Leonard Peltier and 11 federal bills that threatened treaty rights. 700 natives marched from San Francisco all the way to Washington, D.C. The walk achieved much of its purpose. The anti-native bills were defeated. The greatest victory of the walk and perhaps of the movement came on August 11th, just days after the protesters arrived, when President Jimmy Carter at the time signed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, lifting the ban on Native spiritual practices. Remember, even though there was the Indian Reorganization Act in 34, which loosened up things, Native spiritual practices have been banned for a long time. There has never been in this country tolerance of the religious freedom of Native peoples in the same way that people who say, like, oh, the First Amendment, we have religious tolerance in this country. That religious tolerance was almost exclusively dedicated to different groups of Christians, initially speaking. Early on, there are some Jewish people, but even Mormons in the 1890s become major cases that challenge the U.S. government. And then we don't see the acceptance of like Jehovah's Witnesses until we see them being accepted as conscientious objectors to World War II in the 1940s, right? So Native people's traditional practices deemed religious were definitely not tolerated by this country. Various federal responses have occurred since 1978. So on the one hand, while they won Native, so if without AIM, we wouldn't have had the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, period. But now we see that there's also federal responses um, uh, to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And so we see that there are two landmark Supreme Court cases after 1978. The first is Ling versus Northwestern Indian Cemetery Protection Association in 1988, where natives argued against the building of a forest road through land deemed sacred and thus appealed to the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled against the natives. The second example is Employment Division versus Smith, wherein Alfred Smith, who belonged to the Native American Church, was fired from his Employment Division job administering service to natives uh, because he had used peyotes. or because the other natives jobs because he had used peyote, which was a restricted substance. The Supreme Court found that his dismissal was still appropriate by Oregon's Employment Division, citing that it was an undue burden on the state's policies from Smith's religious conviction. We then get the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, which granted tribal governments exclusive jurisdiction over children and custody residing on reservations, presumptive of jurisdiction over Native children off reservation and foster care. Now, a couple of things I want to note here is that, like, even though there's this act called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Dr. Tink Tinker and Vine Deloria Jr., who is a legal scholar, at went through all of the cases, and Native peoples, even though that federal act was passed, when Native peoples try to challenge the U.S. government on the grounds of American religious freedom, of American Indian religious freedom, they don't win the actual cases, right? So we want to be careful about saying like, oh, well, this act was passed and it was such a great thing. And then the same thing, although Indian Child Welfare Act was meant to protect Native children from being removed and adopted into non-native families, which is a form of, under the Genocide Convention, a forced stealing or forced removal of children. We have seen in recent years, especially by conservative forces in the US government, the idea they want to remove race. So they say like, so you have conservative forces saying, and usually conservative Christian forces, by the way, saying like, oh, well, we need to get rid of the Indian Child Welfare Act because it identifies people on the basis of race, Indian, and says that Indian children have to stay with Indian people. So that's racist because they're identifying it as race. And so that by removing that, by trying to remove Indian Child Welfare Act, it actually furthers the removal of children from Native communities. So it furthers genocide from the international law perspective. So these laws we have to be very careful with, and this is why I'm ending the course this way, because there's so much to be said about legal relationships, about federal Indian law. The more that the federal Indian law is inculcated into regular civil law or to appeals to the Bill of Rights, like in the First Amendment, as said a few minutes ago, well, that relies on, first of all, Indians becoming citizens of the United States and then appealing to the relationships with the U.S. government as the authoritative force, and then the U.S. government still not recognizing Native peoples or undermining Native groups, right? So later responses in 1990, responses, so there's a big uproar against the Employment Division versus Smith in U.S. Congress, so it creates this tension between Congress and the Supreme Court. We also see the Native Graves Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which requires institutions receiving federal funding to return cultural items to lineal descendants of tribes. It lays out similar plans for the remains on federal lands, but that doesn't apply to private ones. So a lot of people who own native remains were descendants of Indian killers or Indian hunters, or state institutions that don't fall under the legislation of NAGPRA. So then we could also look at Kennewick Man, who was found in 1996, and there was a 20-year legal battle over his DNA. So the local Native people said you can't take Kennewick Man out of the ground because of NAGPRA, right? He's our ancestor, you can't have them. But scientists said, you don't know. Native people don't know. He might even be a European person. And so all of these tests are done in the name of science on the skeletal remains. And of course, they come out back and find eventually that, like, yep, the native people are right. He was their ancestor. And then there's this ongoing battle for over 20 years to get his remains repatriated. Then again, like I said, U.S. government Congress overwhelmingly supported Smith and Employment Division versus Smith, resulting in broad support for what shows up in 1993-94 as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and then 1994 amendments to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But like I said, Tink Tinker and Vindaloria have said that when they look into actual court cases following ERFA, natives don't tend to win in court. That's the last of my slides here, but I'm going to, as I said, enter into a couple of uh, final remarks to get us into the 21st century. One is that there's a more recent case from the early 2000s um, called Gonzalez versus the UDV Church or Unio do Vegetal, which is an ayahuasca church from South America. Their religion, their theology is Christian, but they benefited from a relationship. It's not a complete uh, acceptance of ayahuasca, which is it has DMT in it, so it's a controlled substance like peyote, right? So it's a psychedelic properties. But the vine is grows in South America naturally. So the UDV Church, a Christian theological church, appealing to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I was just talking about, and identifying themselves as Native, um, or having relationships to Native people from the Amazon when an agreement with the DEA. So it's not a full exemption, but they win an agreement through their Supreme Court case. On at the same time, Native groups up here um, continue to face legal battles and challenges where they're not recognized, but these Christian churches are being recognized. So that creates ongoing legal issues with respect to the ways that uh, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act actually supports these conservative moves like the Hobby Lobby decisions, so the 21st century controversial cases around people denying, making cakes for gay couples and things like that, which Colorado was one of those cases. So you see these court cases being manipulated to benefit non-native people. And that's always been part of Native American history, right? Even from the railroad relationships with the um, during the 1860s and the following decades after that. Even after the emancipation of slaves, we see legislation such as the 14th and 15th Amendment of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments of the Constitution being reappropriated by the 1880s, not to benefit recently freed slaves, but to benefit white organizations that are inherently racist as well. So that's a little bit exceeds the Native American history class, but something to be thinking about is the way that these laws might seem like they're good on the surface or that they're addressing something progressively, but then they get manipulated to be to make things worse for Native peoples. In recent years, the most famous protest that we have had was just before the COVID pandemic. You might remember the activism against the Dakota Access Pipeline. But I wanted to draw attention to there are splintered groups. There's Colorado American Indian Movement, which had splintered off from that Minneapolis, the original movement from the 70s, and the split was over that murder of Anna Mae Akash. And the people who taught me coming up, like Dr. Tink Tinker, for example, or Glenn Morris, like although I'm not a native person, right, as a scholar and as a thinker, I'm influenced by Colorado American Indian movement. So you can see that in the ways that the kind of information that I present in my lectures, right? And by naming the injustices done to somebody like Ward Churchill as a scholar, for example, right? That's all part of the influence there as well. But more recently, we have seen other Native groups, like the Red Nation down in Albuquerque, who I mentioned, who have published the Red Deal. And so, just a couple of things um, I want to note here. because in their introduction here, Nick Estes and the other folks who wrote this draw attention to all the things I've been saying in this lecture. So, for example, we see the New Deal by FDR in the 1930s, but they say we should be mindful of the pitfalls of New Deals. The New Deal in the U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's uh, New Deal was, after all, between Northern industrialists and Southern racists to save capitalism from itself during the Great Depression. It was hardly a people's deal though it benefited workers and provided necessary relief. For indigenous people came an Indian New Deal, as it was known, which itself had mixed results. It brought jobs to the reservations that never had them, improved infrastructure, and built it where it was absent, and in one instance, partially restored buffalo herds that had been annihilated by the countrymen, or sorry, by the military and by the hunters a generation ago, back in the 1890s, right? Or in the late 19th century. At the same time, the Indian New Deal's hallmark legislation was the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which ended allotment, the Dawes Act from 1887, and repealed a ban on dancing and spiritual practices. It also provided the means to create federally recognized councils, which in some cases replaced customary governments, those traditional governments. This is a quote from Vine Deloria, the Sioux had climbed from absolute deprivation to mere poverty, and Hung Papa, intellectual Vindeloria Jr. said, describing the changes for his people, quote, and it was the best time on the reservations ever had. But elsewhere, it was an engineered nightmare. In the Navajo Nation, for example, Indian agents slaughtered more than half of the reservation's livestock. This included about 500,000 sheep and provided not only income and food, but which had been integrated as a central facet of the Dene culture and worldview. It was a top-down environmental conservation plan that came directly from Washington, D.C., with the logic that settlers can manage native lands and lives better than native people. This is a historic issue with conservation movements in the country. So that's what I want to leave people's attention to is that in ongoing Native relationships, we have on the one hand progressive movements like AOC's The Green New Deal, which Native people don't fully reject, but they say we need to actually take it further. We need to consider the ongoing issues that Native peoples face. So that's where they get the term Red Deal from instead of the Green New Deal. And they want to draw attention to the fact that even though we have these kind of progressive movements towards environmental consciousness, if those movements and policies are not made with indigenous lives in mind, then they're going to continue to keep making the same mistakes that occur because colonizers don't understand what native life is and that native life continues to exist in on this continent, in this country, but also across Canada, Mesoamerica, Central America, and South America as well. So what we have are movements that are not just like Standing Rock. What you really want to pay attention to is that there have been movements like Idle No More up in Canada, and I'm just going to list these out and then I'll end. We want to see that Native movements, if we're like, we want to be drawing our attention in Native American history to the ongoing presence of Native peoples and looking at Native activism as one way to do it. Um, so I'm just going to drop in here with Senator Ed Markey, um, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez um, proposed a new Green New Deal in 2019. Standing Rock, however, was part of a constellation of indigenous-led uprisings across North America and the U.S. occupied Pacific due to desert rock in 2006, um, Unistiton Camp in 2010, Keystone XL Pipeline in 2011, Idle No More up in Canada in 2012, Trans Mountain in 2013, Enbridge Line, so these are all oil lines, and Enbridge Line 3 in 2014, Protect Mauna Kea, which is in Hawaii, in 2014, Save Oak Flat 2015, Nahigal Bay Ina in 2015, Bayou Bridge in 2017, O'odam Anti-Border Collective in 2019, Kumeyaay Defense Against the Border Wall in 2020, and then the 1492 Land Back Lane 2020 in 2020, amongst many more. So there's a resurgence of Native activism that's ongoing if you are willing to pay attention to Native people's ongoing plight and ongoing struggles, which I think is the best thing that you could do after taking a Native American history class, alongside my advice of saying that I've assigned as much as I could. I've covered so much in these lectures this summer that I've been making them, and it's not enough, right? Like one class is not enough. I have not, importantly, I've not claimed any kind of insider Native knowledge myself. I'm not a Native person. I critique Euro-Christian culture, but I am a Euro-Christian myself as well. And so it is not an outright attack on the religion of Christianity, as I've said in earlier lectures, right? It's on the so that we have to take our historical memory back to a time before there was any kind of idea of a separation of church and state and politics. And we need to see that through cases like Johnson v. McIntosh, which incorporates papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law and still continues to be cited in Supreme Court cases and other circuit court cases all the way into the 20 teens on the 21st century, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, famous decision, um, uh, uh, um, in Oneida versus City of New York, I believe is the case. Um, that it's one thing to think about like, oh, the past was, in the past there was religious discrimination or something like that. But the problem is not only the past, the problem is that the past exists and continues to exist in the laws that are cited by the Supreme Court against Native peoples. And those laws say that the right that the United States has to exist is because it inherited the rights of discovery from the European colonizing forces that go all the way back to the papal bulls of the 1490s following Columbus, right? Which is why Columbus is ideologically taught in US public schools, even though we know it's a fact that there were Vikings from Europe close to the year 1000 that were coming over to the North American continent. So we want to remember, just remember as I'm ending here, that that process of discovery is part of a ceremonial Euro-Christian process to baptize land and to convert the land into property, and then the missionizing efforts to kill cultures that existed before which is cultural genocide, and then to convert all native peoples into a Euro-Christian worldview, and eventually move them to reservations, but then assimilate them through racist and genocidal blood quantum laws. That sometimes later on, when people are like, "Oh, well, I'm 1% this," or I'm like, like I'm 30% this," like that is using colonizer logic about blood quantum that was designed to erase Native peoples and Native cultures to begin with. So please take that with you as you continue on your way. Try to pay attention to Native activism and to initiatives not only to acknowledge the presence of Native groups, but to this broader efforts around issues such as land back. Thanks very much for your attention this summer. Take care, and I hope that the end of your term papers and things like that, your research goes well. I've given you lots of areas hopefully to look into in more depth. Bye.